The orc woman they called a curse-bringer was standing in Ashvale's market square when Aldrich the blacksmith started talking. It was a seventh day, which meant the grain merchants were open, and most of the village had come down from their hills and holdings to trade and gossip and stand in the weak autumn sun. Aldrich had a voice like iron striking iron, loud and carrying and built for a forge, not a conversation. And he used it the way men use tools they know too well. Without thought, without precision, without care for what they might break. He said the orc woman had been standing outside his daughter's window the night before last. He said she had been there in the dark with her pack of roots and powders and things that smelled of the deep forest, and that no creature who traveled alone through human lands with a bag full of things nobody could name was a healer. He said there was a word for what she was, and the word was not healer, and it was not merchant, and it was not guest. He let the square fill in the blank itself, which it was happy to do. People laughed. Not all of them. But enough that the sound had weight. The orc woman stood in the square with her travel pack at her feet and did not move. She was tall the way her kind were tall, broader in the shoulder than most human men, with tusks that curved up from her lower jaw, not savagely, not like a weapon, but gently, the way river stones are shaped by water over long years. Her skin was the color of new limes, that particular yellow-green that sits between living and bright, and her hair was dark and pulled back from her face with a strip of leather. She had amber eyes, the color of pine resin, and they were still. She had a stillness about her that some people read as threat and others might have read as patience if they had been paying a different kind of attention. She was 26 years old. She had been standing in squares like this one before. Her name was Zara. She had been called worse things than what Aldrich was implying, and she had survived all of them. Ethan was leaning against the post outside the grain merchant's stall. He watched. He was not a man who put himself into other people's business without reason, and he had not yet found his reason. He had a craftsman's hands, scarred and capable, and a craftsman's habit of looking at things carefully before deciding what they needed. He watched the square, and he watched the orc woman, and he watched Aldrich's face, red with the pleasure of an audience, and he went very still himself. The two of them, the woman in the square and the man at the post, were the stillest things in Ashvale that morning. Then a scream came from the direction of the well. A girl was being half carried, half dragged by two men, her leg bent at an angle that made several people in the square look away. She had fallen into the dry well shaft on the east side of the square, the one the village council had been arguing about covering for 3 seasons, and the men carrying her were shouting for the healer. Someone told them that Marin the hedge witch had gone east over the mountains before the first frost, and was not expected back until spring thaw. The village had no healer. It had not had one for 4 months. The girl's name was Lena. She was 16, and she was Aldrich's daughter, the same daughter he had said the orc woman was lurking outside the window of. Her leg was broken. Anyone could see that. Her head had struck the stone lip of the well shaft on the way down, and the blood was coming fast down the side of her face and soaking into her collar. Lena had gone somewhere quiet inside herself, the way people do when the pain gets large enough, and her eyes were open but not focused, and Aldrich was making a sound that had nothing of the forge in it at all. Ethan stepped off the post. He looked at the girl. He looked at the orc woman and said, "You've got medicine in that pack." It was not a question. Zara was already kneeling beside her pack. They carried Lena to the grain merchant's back room because it was closest, and it had a wide table, and the merchant, a practical woman named Bereth, had cleared it without being asked the moment she understood what was needed. Zara called for clean water and more light and something rigid she could use for splinting. Ethan went for the wood himself. He came back with 3 straight lengths of seasoned ash and set them on the table without comment, and then took Lena's hand the way a person holds something they intend not to let go of. He did not look away, and he did not speak, except once, when Lena made a sound that was more fear than pain, and he said her name quietly and kept his eyes on her face until she found his. The square had followed them to the door and the window. The same square that had been laughing 10 minutes ago was now pressed 3 deep against the glass. Zara worked the way deep water moves, with a purpose that had no interest in being watched. Her hands were not small hands. They were broad across the palm and strong in the fingers, and they had done this before, many times, in worse light, and with worse tools, and with less room than this. The people watching could see the difference between someone who had learned a thing from a book and someone who had lived inside it, who carried it in their bones like a second skeleton. She cleaned the head wound first, assessed it with 2 fingers and her eyes, and the particular quality of attention that has no room for anything outside the task. She said the bone of the skull was not compromised. She said Lena needed to stay awake. She said these things to Ethan without looking at him, and he relayed them to Aldrich, who stood in the doorway with his big hands hanging at his sides, and for once said nothing. Then she set the leg. The sound it made when it seated back into place was one that nobody in the room forgot quickly. Lena arched up and cried out, and Ethan held her arm and her shoulder and kept talking low, and even until she came back down, and Zara had already moved past the sound to what came next, wrapping the splint with a sureness that was also a kind of gentleness, the way you handle something that is both broken and still capable of healing. Ethan watched her hands without meaning to. The certainty of them. The way they moved through something that would have made most people in that room take a step backward, or 2 steps, or leave entirely. She was young was the thing that kept occurring to him. Young in the way of someone who had learned everything early and had not stopped learning since. When she finished, she turned to Aldrich and told him what Lena would need. Rest, the splint unchanged for 6 weeks, the poultice on the head wound twice daily for the first 10 days, no weight on the leg before spring. She said it plainly, without apology, and without the particular performance of patience that humans expected from those asking for their goodwill. She said it the way a person says a thing they know to be true. Aldrich looked at his daughter. He looked at Zara. He said nothing. Lena, who had come back to herself slowly during the splinting, looked up at the orc woman from the table. Her eyes were wet. "Will it heal right?" she asked. "Yes," Zara said, "if you rest it." Her eyes went briefly wet too, though she did not cry, because she was 16 and the whole village was watching. Ethan sent the crowd back. He thanked Bereth and paid her for the use of the room without being asked. Zara repacked her travel pack with the same order she always used. Each thing returned to its place. Ethan watched that too, the precision of it, the way nothing was careless, the way each wrapped bundle and sealed clay pot went back to exactly where it had come from. It was the organization of someone who might need to find something in the dark, without light, in a hurry. Outside, the square had gone quiet in a different way than before. Zara put her pack on her back. She did not look around the square for acknowledgement. She had stopped expecting that some years ago. Ethan fell into step beside her. "Where are you headed tonight?" he asked. She named the inn, at the south end of the road. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said the inn had no rooms. The autumn traders had come through 2 days ago ahead of the weather, and the rooms were full through the weekend. He said this without apology, in the manner of a man stating facts. She stopped walking. "The Tanner's Lodge takes travelers," she said. "Not all of them," he said. He said it without ornament. She understood what he meant. She had 3 more names. He met each one with the same quiet correction. The picture assembled itself without him having to state it plainly. There was nowhere in Ashvale that would take an orc woman traveling alone with a pack full of things nobody could name. Not after Aldrich's speech in the square. Not tonight. Probably not tomorrow. She looked at him. Her amber eyes were level and unreadable. "There's a room off my workshop," Ethan said. "Got its own outside door. Stove that works. Cot's decent. He looked at the square, then back at her. "You're welcome to it until you find something else, or until the traders clear out." She said, "They'll talk." He said, "They're already talking." She said, "About you too, if I stay." He looked at her directly. "I know." A pause. "I don't care what the village thinks," he said. Zara stood for a moment with her pack on her back and the wind coming in off the ridge and the last of the afternoon light pulling the color out of the market stalls. She looked at him the way she had learned to look at people, carefully, without investing in the outcome, reading what was true rather than what was performed. What she read was, he meant it. She picked up her pack properly and said, "Lead the way. If you're already seeing where this is going, stay with it, because where it goes is not where you think." The workshop was on the northern edge of Ashvale, set back from the road behind a low stone wall with the smell of sawdust and linseed oil and the particular clean sharpness of metal shavings. Ethan was a joiner by trade, furniture, structural beams, the carved lintels above doorways that the wealthier families of Ashvale commissioned when they wanted to say something about themselves without speaking. His work was good, not showy, but good in the way of things built to last rather than to impress. The back room was exactly what he had described. Small, clean, smelling of old wood and the ghost of some dried herb that had once hung from the ceiling beam. There was a cot, a stove, a window that looked out at the fence post line, and beyond it the dark open of the autumn pasture, and a door with its own iron latch that led outside. Not through the workshop, not through his house. Outside, with its own path. He had thought about that, she understood. The separate door, giving the village less to say than it wanted. Zara set her pack down beside the cot with the care of someone setting down something they would need to find in the dark. Ethan built the fire without asking. She watched him do it, the economical way he laid the wood, the single strike of flint, the patience to wait for it to catch without fussing. He left the extra wood stacked against the wall and said he would leave the kitchen door unlocked in the morning, that there was porridge grain on the second shelf if she was up before him. He left her to it. She stood in the small warm room for a moment, listening to his footsteps fade across the yard, and something in her chest settled that had been coiled since she had walked into Ashvale's market square. Word travels in a small village the way weather does, low and fast, and ahead of itself. By the next morning, people knew where the orc woman was staying. By the afternoon, a woman came to the workshop gate with a child who had not kept food down in 3 days. She stood at the gate and did not come through it, as if an invisible boundary had been drawn at the entrance, as if crossing it would mean admitting something. Zara came to the gate herself. She examined the child there, in the lane, which was not ideal, but was what she had. She asked questions in a low, even voice, the kind of voice you use with frightened people and with children and with animals, the voice that is actually a kind of offering, an extended hand that says you do not have to come all the way over if you are not ready. She gave the mother a wrapped parcel of dried ginger root and a small sealed pot and instructions for both, and she told her how to tell if the child's condition was worsening and what to do if it did. The mother looked at the pack on Zara's back. She looked at the tusks. She looked at the lime-green hands that had just handed her something she was about to take into her house and put into her child. She took it. She said nothing. She went. The child kept its food down by nightfall. The mother told no one except her sister, who told her neighbor, who came the next afternoon with a husband who had an infected cut on his forearm that had gone hot and red and was beginning to smell of things that made him nervous. Zara handled it the same way she handled everything, without making more of it than it was, without the performance of reassurance, without the false brightness that frightened people sometimes expected from healers, as if good news had to come wrapped in a costume. The cut was cleaned and packed with a poultice and bound, and the man was told to come back in 2 days and to watch for certain signs in between. He left with his arm held carefully at his side, walking as though he were carrying something valuable, which he was. People came and went, first cautiously, then with less caution, then with the matter-of-fact regularity of people who have found something useful and have decided to use it. Most of them came in the evening or in the low morning light, which is how people in small places do the things they are not yet ready to be seen doing. Ethan observed all of it without commentary. The way Zara moved through the kitchen in the early gray of morning, the steady register she used with frightened visitors, the way each instrument went back to its exact place without her having to look, the small clay pots arranged in an order that meant something to her, a logic he had not yet learned. He did not remark on any of it. But he noticed. By the end of the first week, the house had found its rhythms without anyone sitting down to arrange them. He was up before light. She rose not long after. By the time he came in from the first morning's work, she had coffee on. Not the weak grain water that most of Ashvale drank, but something she brewed with bark and roasted chicory root that was strong enough to be worth the effort, and whatever the larder allowed for the morning. One morning she was at the window with her cup, watching the frost come off the fence posts in the early sun, and he came in from the yard and poured his own cup and sat, and they ate in silence. After a while he said, "Sleep all right?" She considered it honestly, the way she considered most things. "Better than I have in a while," she said. He nodded at his plate and did not pursue it. But something in the answer had registered in his face, and she could see that it had. An old man named Corvin came on a Tuesday with a chest that rattled when he breathed. A deep, wet sound like something loose in a bellows. Zara listened with her ear against his back and her eyes closed, in the way of someone reading something important in a language they had spent years learning. The sound of lungs was a language. You learn to distinguish the wet from the dry, the deep from the shallow, the kind of rattle that would pass from the kind that would not. She gave him something for the congestion and showed him how to sleep propped at an angle so the fluid would not settle in the night. She told him what to eat and what to stay away from, and which warning signs meant he should come back immediately. He left walking a little straighter than he had arrived, his shoulders down from his ears for the first time in weeks. He was back 3 days later, not with a new complaint, but to tell her the rattling had eased. He seemed to feel this was information she should have. He was right. A Thursday evening, Ethan came in late, past the point of politeness, and supper was already on the table and had been for some time. Zara was at her end of the table with her field notes spread in front of her, reading while she waited. He came through the door and washed his hands at the basin and looked at the table. "You didn't have to hold it," he said. "It keeps fine," she said, without looking up. He sat down and served himself. She set her notes aside and served herself. The fire worked in the grate. Outside, the wind had come in off the ridge and was making its presence known against the shutters. After a while, he said the fence on the high north field would need a full day's work before the hard freeze came. She asked how long he had. He said, maybe a week. She told him Corvin's chest had sounded clearer that morning, that she thought the old man would get through the winter if he kept to the things she had told him. Ethan looked at her across the table. She looked back. 2 people in a warm kitchen, with wind outside and supper between them and nothing urgent being said, and it had the quality of something that had been going on quietly for much longer than it actually had. He looked back down at his plate. She picked up her notes. The evening continued. It was one of those evenings in the deep blue before full dark when Ethan came around the side of the workshop and found Zara already on the bench along the front wall, her hands in her lap and nothing in them, watching the last light drain from the pasture. He sat beside her. He had his coffee, and she had hers, and for a time neither of them said anything. Then he said, "Where did you learn it?" She looked at the pasture. The question sat in the air between them. She had been asked, over the years, where she was from, where she was going, what was in her pack, whether her tusks ever got in the way. Nobody had asked her where she had learned what she knew. Not like that. not as though the learning itself was the thing worth asking about. "A woman named Sarah," she said, "in the orc settlements east of the Greywood. I was 14. He waited. "I grew up in the border camp," she said, "after the war. Most of the children there did. Sarah was a war healer. She'd served in the orc armies and come out the other side with her kit and her knowledge, and no particular place to use them. She came to the camp when the children were sick." Zara's voice was level. It was not a performance of levelness. It was simply the voice of someone describing a thing that had happened. "I followed her around until she let me help. Then, until she let me do more than help. She died when I was 22. She left me her pack and her books and her notes. The last color was leaving the sky. A horse shifted in Ethan's pen and breathed out a long, slow breath that hung visible in the cold. After that," Zara said, "I moved. Settlement to settlement, village to village. Human lands, mostly, people need what I know, and they are more likely to need it in places that don't already have someone like Sarah." She said it plainly, without asking for anything in return. But there was something underneath the plainness that said this was not a story she had been asked to tell before, and she was still deciding what it was like to be asked. Ethan turned his cup in his hands. "Must get lonesome," he said. "Crossing between places." She considered it honestly. "You stop noticing after a while," she said. "Or you think you do." He looked at her then, not quickly, not sideways. Directly, the way a person looks at something they have been watching from the corner of their eye for some time and have finally decided to face properly. She held it without looking away. Her amber eyes were steady and unguarded for perhaps the first time since she had come to Ashvale. After a moment, he looked back at the ridge. He stood and picked up both cups. "Cold's coming in," he said. She rose beside him. They went inside. The door closed. The night settled over the workshop and the room behind it and the pasture beyond the fence. Now here is where most stories about someone like Zara would turn comfortable. But stay with it. It was the third week when the rumor reached Ashvale. A trader from the river road brought it, the way traders bring everything, without malice, simply as part of the cargo of information that moves with goods along roads, unfiltered and unverified, and arriving with the authority of distance. He said an orc woman matching Zara's description had been through the mill town of Carenford 2 seasons back. He said a child had died under her care. He said a family had buried their boy and pointed the finger at the green-skinned traveler with the pack of powders, and the mayor of Carenford had agreed to look into it. Aldrich heard it before dinner. Martha, the weaver's wife, who had not quite forgiven the world since the year her husband's business failed, heard it before supper. By the time the lamp oil merchants were closing their shutters, it had moved through Ashvale the way a spark moves through dry straw. The woman who had brought her child to the gate stopped coming. Corvin did not appear that week. The warmth that had been building, slowly and cautiously, pulled back like water before a frost. Zara did not defend herself. The habit of silence ran deep. She had learned long ago that defense without evidence sounds like guilt, and that the kind of people who spread this kind of story are not interested in evidence. She went on with her work. She kept Lena's follow-up visit. She sent Corvin a new supply of his remedy with a note via Bereth, the grain merchant, who was one of the few people in Ashvale who had not decided anything. Ethan heard the rumor on a Friday morning at the feed merchant's, from 2 men who did not know he was standing behind them. He came home and split wood for a long time in the cold. The sound of the axe was steady and even and did not hurry. Then he came inside. She was at the table with her notes. He poured coffee and stood at the window, and the silence held for a while before he said, "There's talk about a child in Carenford." Zara set her pen down. She looked at her hands flat on the table. Her hands, which were lime green and broad, and which had done nothing wrong. "A boy," she said. 6 years old. He had swallowed something from his father's workroom, a preparation for treating wood, caustic, the kind that burns from the inside. His family sent for me because I was the closest thing to a healer in 3 days' ride. She looked at her hands. By the time I got there, he had been sick for 2 days. The damage to his throat was already done. I stayed the whole night. I tried everything I had. There was nothing to be done when I arrived, and nothing to be done after. A pause. I stayed anyway. The kitchen was very quiet. The family needed something to be the cause, she said. I was there. I was convenient. She said it without bitterness, which was the hardest kind of truth to speak. The mayor of Carenford did look into it. He found what I just told you. He cleared it. But the traitor doesn't know that part, or didn't think it worth carrying. Ethan looked at her for a long time. She did not look away from her hands. All right, he said. He picked up his coffee and turned back to the window. She sat at the table with her hands flat on the surface and the lamp burning low beside her notes. And the silence after those 2 words was a different kind of silence than the one before them. He believed her. That simply. Without requiring her to prove it, without making her perform her own innocence for him. He had listened and he had decided, and the decision was 2 syllables, and it was enough. She did not reach for her notes again for a long time. The people of Ashvale are practical, as people in small places tend to be. Because the alternative to practicality in a small place is going without. Word came through the postmaster at the start of the 5th week that Marin the hedge witch had taken a permanent post on the other side of the mountains and would not be returning to her circuit. People stood around that information for a day or 2, and then did what people do with information that is inconvenient. They got practical about it. Quietly, without anyone deciding it formally or calling a meeting or posting a notice, they began bringing things to Zara. Not to the gate, this time. To the workshop door, then to the room itself. A broken finger, set and wrapped. A wound gone hot and red that needed daily watching. An infant's cough the mother could not ease. When a night call came, a farmer's wife laboring poorly 2 miles out along the ridge road, Ethan had the horse ready before Zara had her pack on her back. She came out the outside door and found him at the gate with the lantern lit, and the horse saddled. And she looked at him, and he looked at her, and she put her foot in the stirrup, and they went. He waited outside in the cold while she worked. When she came out 2 hours later, he was still there, standing with the horse and the lantern, which he had kept lit against the dark. They rode back without discussion. It happened that way every time after. Martha kept her sideways looks and her careful silences and the particular posture of a woman who has decided something and is not going to undecide it on account of evidence. She kept all of this until the night her youngest nephew's cough turned sharp enough to frighten her out of her principles. She came after dark to the workshop gate, which she would not have done in daylight for any sum, and she stood at it with the child in her arms and the very specific expression of a woman who has let pride carry her exactly as far as fear will allow, and not one step further. Zara opened the door before Martha knocked. She took the child in without comment, without expression, without making Martha acknowledge anything she was not ready to acknowledge. She worked until the child's breathing eased. She sent him back before dawn with a remedy for the next 4 days and instructions for a 5th if it persisted. Martha did not apologize. She would not. But she stopped speaking against Zara, which in Ashvale carried almost as far. There are people, Zara had learned, who would rather die than say they were wrong. The best you could do was make it easy for them to stop being wrong without having to say it. It had been a hard week. A difficult birth had kept Zara 2 nights running out along the river road. She had come home both mornings gray with exhaustion and the kind of quiet that was not peace, but the absence of the energy required for anything else. Ethan had said nothing, either morning. He had simply left things where she would find them. Coffee kept warm on the back of the stove. A plate covered and set at the end of the table nearest the fire, the water basin already filled. Not performance. Not announcement. Just things, in places, where she would find them when she needed them. On the Friday, she came home before dark, which was unusual, and sat in the chair nearest the fire without taking her pack off properly, just setting it against the arm and letting herself be still. Ethan came in from the livestock and found her there. He sat in the other chair with a length of leather harness he was repairing, and the fire did what fires do, and the house settled around them into its evening sounds. The creak of the floor, the shift of the wood in the grate, the horse moving in the pen outside. After a while, her eyes closed. He went on with the leather. He did not get up and leave. He did not do anything, exactly. He was simply there, in the chair 3 feet from hers, working on a piece of harness by firelight. The way a person is simply present in a place where they belong. When he rose to add a log, she had drifted toward him by some slow gravity he had not planned for, and she had not planned for either, her head coming to rest against his shoulder with the ease of something that has finally found the angle it was looking for and settled. He went still. He set the leather on the arm of the chair. He did not move her. He did not speak. He sat with her weight against his shoulder and the fire working in the grate and the wind pressing at the shutters, and he knew what this was. He had known what it was for some time. He had been watching it approach the way you watch weather coming in over the ridge, and now it had arrived, and it was different from how he had imagined weather to feel when you were standing inside it. He woke deep in the night with the fire burned to coals, and the cold beginning to press in at the windows, and the sound of her breathing slow and even against his collar. He got up carefully, very carefully, the way you move when you are trying not to wake something that has finally found rest. He built the fire back. He found the thick wool blanket from the chest by the wall and settled it over her, tucking it at the edges the way you cover something you intend to stay covered. He stood a moment in the low firelight, looking at her face, which in sleep had let go of its watchfulness entirely. The alertness that she wore like a second skin during her waking hours, the slight readiness in her jaw, the attention that lived behind her eyes, all of it had gone, and what was left was simply a face. A face with tusks that curved upward like river-worn ivory, and skin the color of early spring, and an expression of such complete rest that he stood there longer than he meant to. He put his coat on and went out before dawn. She woke late with the fire warm and the blanket around her, and the light of a winter morning coming gray through the window. She looked at the other chair, the piece of leather on its arm, the fire that someone had tended to a specific size that would last through the morning, the blanket which had come from the chest across the room. She did not move for a long time. She sat in the chair with the blanket around her shoulders and her coffee, which was also warm, which had also been left deliberately, and she let herself know what she knew. It had been clear before this. She was honest enough to admit that. It had been clear in the coffee left without comment, and the fire built before dawn, and the horse waiting at the gate in the cold, and the 2 words, "All right," spoken into a kitchen after she had told him the worst thing anyone had said about her in 3 years. She had known. She had been choosing, carefully and quietly, not to act on what she knew, for reasons she was familiar with. Orc and human. Traveler and settled person. Someone the village had been laughing at in the square 5 weeks ago, and someone the village trusted. She had made the calculation and arrived at the same answer every time, which was, there is no version of this that doesn't cost him something, and he hasn't chosen to spend that, and it is not yours to spend for him. But he had built the fire back, and found the blanket, and gone out before dawn so she would not have to be watched waking up in his chair with his blanket around her shoulders, which was either the most considerate thing anyone had done for her in years or something else, and she was old enough at 26 to know that those 2 things were not mutually exclusive. The last of the summer's livestock came down from the high pasture on a Saturday, which meant the harvest festival in the square that evening, lanterns strung between the posts. A fiddle from the Millward brothers, tables of food that people had been quietly preparing for a week. The farmers and woodcutters and craftspeople of Ashville coming down from their holdings with the particular looseness of people who have finished a hard thing and are ready, briefly, to set it down. Zara had not intended to go. Ethan was going. He mentioned it at breakfast, without pressure, without invitation, simply as a fact about the evening. She found herself saying she supposed she could come. She found him watching her face with a quality of attention that she was increasingly unable to misread. She wore her better traveling clothes, which were not fine, but were clean and pressed, and she stood at the edge of the lamplight in the square where the festival had organized itself into the particular warmth of people who have known each other their whole lives, gathered together in the cold. She was used to the edge of things. She knew exactly how much of herself to make visible in a crowd like this, and how much to keep back. She had been doing it in human villages since she was 22. Ethan came and stood beside her. He had his cup and she had hers, and they stood in the familiar silence they had made between them over 5 weeks of mornings and evenings, and the particular quiet of two people who had stopped needing to fill the spaces. The fiddle slowed. The square reorganized itself in the way of a place where everyone knows what comes next. Ethan looked at her. "Dance with me," he said. She looked at the square. At the people who were already watching from the corners of their eyes, or not from the corners, some of them directly, the way people in small places look at things they are not sure how to categorize. She handed him her cup. He set both cups on the nearest table and offered his hand, and she looked at it for a moment, his scarred craftsman's hand, extended in the lamplight, and she took it, and they walked out into the square. He was not a graceful man in the way of those who have been taught to be graceful. He was something better for it. Steady. He knew the rhythm, and he kept it without fuss, and she found the measure of him quickly and settled into it. His hand was at her back, and her hand was in his, and he was looking at her. Not past her shoulder, not at the crowd, not at the cobblestones, at her, with an expression that had arrived at something it had been working toward for a long time and had finally gotten there. "They're staring," she said. "I know," he said. He did not look away from her to verify. The song ended. Neither of them stepped back. The fiddle started something livelier, and some people around them laughed and moved, and Ethan looked down at her. "Walk with me," he said. They left the lamplight and went to the quiet end of the street, where the square's noise became something distant and the cold came off the ridge clean and particular, the way cold does when there is nothing between you and the open country. The stars were very bright. Zara could see the Wanderer's belt overhead, which her people had different names for, names that had been told to her in the border camp by women who had carried them out of the Greywood. Ethan stopped. He looked out at the dark beyond the last building, and she could see him ordering something, arranging words with the care of a man who builds things to last and has no interest in shoddy work. "The village knows what you do," he said. "Finally, they needed you, and they know it now." He paused. "And I need what you do too." A pause. "Not the medicine," he said. He looked at her. "I mean the rest of it." She stood very still. The cold was sharp around them, and the fiddle was a distant sweetness, and the stars were very bright. "You know what they'll say," she said. "An orc woman, staying permanent, in a human craftsman's house." "I know exactly what they'll say," he said. "Aldrich, we'll have to live with it," he said. "Same as everyone else." She looked at him for a long moment. In the lamplight from the distant square, she could see the steadiness in his face that she had been watching since the first morning she woke in his workshop room and found the coffee already warm. It was not the steadiness of a man who had not thought about the cost. It was the steadiness of a man who had thought about it carefully and arrived at an answer he intended to keep. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "Permanent, as my wife, if that's what you'd want. Not on account of practicality or winter or the village needing a healer. I want that to be clear. It was clear. It had been clear in the coffee, and the fire, and the blanket, and the horse at the gate, and the 2 words, "All right?" and the question on the bench. Where did you learn it? The first time she could remember anyone wanting to know something about her that was not contained in the inventory of her pack. Her hand found his at his side. She placed it there, deliberately, warm against the cold night air. "Yes," she said. "That's what I want." He turned his hand and closed it around hers. They stood in the dark at the end of the quiet street, with the fiddle playing without them, and the stars bright overhead, and neither of them in any hurry to go back into the warmth. If this story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath somewhere in there, tell me in the comments which moment got you. They were married on the last clear day before the first snowfall, on the steps of the village hall rather than the temple, because the hall's steps were wider and Ethan wanted there to be room for people to stand. A pine bow had been fixed to the door, as the custom was. The officiant was brief, because Ethan had asked him to be brief, and the man had been sensible enough to understand why. More people came than either of them had expected. Corvin came, with his chest clearer than it had been in years, and his shoulders squared. The woman who had first brought her child to the gate came, with the child on her hip and an expression of careful neutrality that was, in its way, a form of support. Bereth the grain merchant came, and stood at the front. Lena came. Her leg was still in its splint, and she moved with crutches that Ethan had made for her in the week after the accident, fitted to her height, with the crosspieces shaped smooth against the underarm so they would not wear. She had not mentioned them. He had simply left them at her door. She stood near the steps and held herself very straight. Aldrich did not come to the ceremony. He was seen, later that day, walking past the hall with his hands in his coat pockets, which was the long way around to the forge. He had taken the long way deliberately, or he had not. Nobody said anything about it, which was the right way to receive it. Zara carried her pack to the steps. As was the custom among her people when joining a household, the healer's pack brought to the threshold, set down, and the threshold crossed without it. Among orcs this meant, I bring what I know, and I set it down, and I enter as a person and not as a function. Among the humans of Ashvale who knew the custom, it meant the same thing. Among those who did not, it was simply a woman setting her bag on the steps, which was also fine. She went inside without it. The people who saw it said nothing, and that was the right way. When it was done, they came out into the cold afternoon, and Ethan's hand was at the small of her back, not gripping, just present, in the way of something that had found the place where it belonged and saw no reason to announce it. They walked home in the early dark. The road was the same road. The cold was the same cold. Behind them, Ashvale settled into its evening, smoke from the chimneys, lamplight finding the windows one by one, the ordinary machinery of a village closing itself against the night. By late winter, there was a room on the east side of Main Street that had not been there before. A proper room with a proper door, built by Ethan in the 2 months after the snow cleared, fitted with a shelf for clay pots and a window that let in the morning light, and a sign that did not say anything, because the people who needed it knew where it was, and the people who did not need it did not need to be addressed. Zara worked in it 3 days a week, and from the workshop room on the others. The pack hung on a hook by the door, which was open most mornings when the weather was decent. People came and went. Fewer of them came at night now, which was its own kind of progress. Aldrich's daughter Lena came back in the spring, walking without the crutches, the leg healed as straight as Zara had promised. She stood in the doorway of the small room, with her hands clasped in front of her, and said that her father had asked her to bring something. She held out a jar of preserved plums, which was the blacksmith's household specialty, and which was understood in Ashvale as the specific currency of acknowledgement between people who were not going to discuss the thing they were acknowledging. Zara accepted the jar. She said thank you. Lena left. She held the jar for a moment, then set it on the shelf above the door where she would see it every time she came in. Not as a trophy. Not as evidence. Simply as a marker of distance traveled from a particular Tuesday morning in the market square. Martha passed the room sometimes on her way to the weaver's quarter, and she did not stop, and she did not look sideways, which was as close to an apology as the village of Asheville was going to get from her. And Zara understood this, and it was enough. In the evenings, Ethan came in from the workshop in the field, and supper was on the table or it was not. And if it was not, they made it together. And the fire worked in the grate, and the pasture lay open and brown or green beyond the fence depending on the season, and the nights came down from the ridge the way nights do, gradually, and then completely. One evening, late in the spring, they were sitting outside on the bench along the front wall the way they sometimes did, him with his coffee and her with hers, watching the last light leave the high fields. The air smelled of new growth and the particular green sharpness of things waking up after cold. A young woman came up the road, couldn't have been more than 17, human, from one of the upland farms from the look of her boots, and she was moving the way people move when they are afraid but have decided that fear is not going to stop them, which is the bravest kind of moving. She had a small child on her hip. The child was flushed and breathing with an effort that was audible from the gate. Zara was already setting down her cup. She met the young woman at the gate and took the child's weight from her, just for a moment, so the mother could get her breath and straighten her arms, and she said, in the low, even voice that she had been using since she was 14 years old, and Sarah had first shown her what it was for. Come in. Tell me how long it's been like this. The young woman came through the gate. She looked at Zara's hands, the lime green skin, the tusks. She looked at the child in those hands, her child, the center of everything. She came through. Ethan watched from the bench. He did not get up. She did not need him to. He sat with his coffee cooling in his hands and watched his wife go inside with the young woman and the sick child. And the door stayed open in the spring evening, and from inside came the low register of a voice asking careful questions in the manner of someone who has all the time in the world and knows. Also, that time is the one thing in short supply. He sat outside until the light was fully gone and the first stars were out. Then he went inside and built the fire up and put water on for the remedy he knew she would need. Because he knew, by now, what she kept in which pot, and what required heat and what required cold, and the particular order she used when she was working quickly. When the young woman left an hour later, the child was breathing easier, and she had a sealed cloth packet and written instructions and a time to come back. She stood at the gate for a moment and looked at the workshop, at the light in the window, at the sign above the door that didn't say anything. Thank you, she said. Zara said she was welcome. She closed the gate and came inside and found the fire rebuilt and the water warm and 2 cups already out on the table. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment, looking at the cups and the fire and the man sitting at the table with a piece of wood he was planning, his pencil moving in the quiet way of someone who has learned how to be in a room with another person without taking it over. She came in and sat across from him and wrapped her hands around her cup. And outside the spring night was cool and clear, and the horses were settled in their pen, and in the pasture beyond the fence the grass was coming back after the long cold, the way things come back, steadily and without announcement, because that is what living things do when they are left to it. And that was how it went, in the village of Asheville. In the year after the orc woman came to the market square with her pack and her stillness and her amber eyes, and a man leaning against a post watched her and waited for his reason, and found it. And if you watched them on those evenings on the bench, the lime green woman and the craftsman with his coffee, you would not have been able to say exactly when the story started. Which was exactly right. Because the best ones never have a clean beginning. They simply are, and then they have been, and you look back and see that something true was assembled quietly, over time, by 2 people who had the patience for it. If you made it all the way here, drop a comment telling me which beat hit hardest. And if you want more stories like this, you know what to do. That winter was the hardest in 12 years, according to Corvin, who remembered all the hard winters with a specificity that suggested he had been keeping score. The ridge road froze solid before the solstice. The river at the valley floor dropped to a crawl and then stopped moving above a certain bend. The cold had a weight to it, a physical presence, like something alive that had moved into the village and intended to stay. Zara was busier than she had ever been in one place. There were the winter fevers, which came every year but came worse this year, moving from household to household the way rumors moved, quietly, then all at once. There were the injuries that cold weather brings, frostbitten hands and feet from people who had stayed out too long in fields that needed tending regardless of the temperature, cracked skin that went infected, a broken wrist from a man who had slipped on the ice behind the grain store. There were also births. Winter, for reasons that were nobody's business, produced a reliable share of spring births, and spring births in a hard winter meant midwinter labors. Zara attended 4 of them between the solstice and the thaw. 3 went well. 1 did not. The baby survived, which was the important thing, but the mother lost a great deal of blood, and it was a long night before anyone in that house could breathe properly. Ethan had waited outside that house for 4 hours in the cold. When Zara came out, she looked at him, and he looked at her, and he did not ask how it had gone, because he could see how it had gone. He brought the horse around, and she got up behind him, and they rode home in the dark without talking. And when they got back, he built the fire, and she washed her hands at the basin and stood there for a long time with the water going cold, looking at nothing. He came and stood beside her. Not touching, just there. After a moment, she dried her hands. He had supper on the table. She ate. The fire worked. They went to bed. In the morning, she was up before him, which was unusual, and when he came down, she had already laid out the things she would need for the day's visits and was writing in her notes with the particular concentration of someone turning a hard night into something useful. He poured his coffee and sat across from her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would be more useful than sitting across from someone while they do the work of converting grief into knowledge. After a while, she looked up. "The baby is well," she said. "I went back this morning to check." "Good," he said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he had not seen on her face before, something quiet and very direct that had to do with the baby being well and him being there in the morning, and a dozen other things that neither of them said because they did not need to. She went back to her notes. He finished his coffee. The day started. There was a particular afternoon in the deep of winter when Ethan came into the main room and found Zara sitting on the floor with her back against the stone of the hearth and a small child in her lap, not a sick child. Simply Bereth, the grain merchant's youngest, who had developed the habit of appearing at their door in the early afternoon and sitting with Zara while she worked, because children are practical about where they feel comfortable and do not explain themselves. The child had fallen asleep against Zara's shoulder. Zara was reading with her free hand, her notes spread on the floor around her, and she was doing all of this with the absolute stillness of someone who has been handed a trust and is not going to disturb it. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked up and saw him, and there was something in her face, not surprise, exactly, but the particular expression of a person caught being fully themselves and not having prepared for it. He went and made tea and brought it to her and set it within reach and went back to the workshop. He did not say anything. What was there to say? She had come to Ashvale alone with a pack and a satchel and the particular learned stillness of someone who had spent years making themselves easy to leave, and here she was on the floor of his kitchen with a sleeping child against her shoulder and her notes spread around her in the firelight. He went back to the workshop and picked up his tools and thought about that for a while. Spring arrived the way it always did, without announcing itself, just one morning that was different from the one before. The frost came off the pasture by midday instead of mid-afternoon. The horses were moving differently in the pen. The birds were back on the fence line that had been empty for months. Zara noticed it from the window of the small room on Main Street. She had been noting things in the margins of her patient records: the weather, the quality of the light, the stage of various plants, since she had been apprenticed to Sarah. Because Sarah had taught her that healing is partly a matter of understanding what season you are in. What the body can do in winter it cannot always do in spring, and cannot always do in summer. And knowing which season you are in is the beginning of knowing what is possible. She made a note in the margin of Corvin's record: first true spring morning. Chest clear. Patient walking to the water pump without stopping. She looked at the note for a moment. She had records for nearly 40 people in Ashevale now, 40 people whose names she knew and whose patterns she understood and whose households she could find in the dark if the need arose. In the border camp, as a child, she had learned what it meant to be known by no one. She had spent 6 years after Sarah's death moving between places, being known by none of them, being useful, and then moving on. She understood, sitting in the small room in the spring morning with 40 names in her records, that she was not moving on. This was not a loss. She spent a few minutes in the morning light being honest with herself about whether it was a loss, and it was not. It was the opposite of a loss. It was the thing she had not known she was constructing, settlement by settlement and winter by winter. The thing that she had kept moving in order to find, a place where what she knew was used and where she herself was, also known. She closed the record book. She went home for breakfast. Ethan was in the yard when she came through the gate, doing something with a fence post that needed 2 hands and a persuasive argument. He looked up when she came through. "You're early," he said. "Nobody came yet," she said. She sat on the bench along the front wall and tilted her face up at the sun, which was weak but present, doing the work that spring sun does. Not warming exactly, but reminding you warmth is possible. She heard him finish with the fence post and heard the particular sound of tools being set down that meant he was done. He sat beside her on the bench. They sat in the spring sun with their faces up, not talking, and the pasture was brown and green in a ratio that would shift daily now toward green. And somewhere past the fence a bird was working very hard on an opinion about the morning. "Lena's mother came in yesterday," Zara said. "She wants to apprentice the girl to me." "Lena wants it too, apparently." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell her?" "I said I would think about it." She paused. "I think I want to say yes." He turned to look at her. She was still looking at the pasture, at the way the light was moving across it, at the bird on the fence post who had not resolved his opinion. "Sarah took me in at 14, she said. I knew nothing. Less than nothing. I knew how to follow someone around and carry things and not get in the way." A pause. "She was patient with me for 8 years. She looked at her hands. The lime green hands, broad and strong, that knew now what they were for. I think I have 8 years of patience to offer someone." Ethan looked at her for a moment with the expression she had come to know as the one that came before something direct. "I think Sarah chose well," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the pasture now, which she understood was how he delivered a thing he meant completely and did not wish to undercut with eye contact. She looked back at the pasture too. "I'll tell Lena's mother yes," she said. The bird on the fence post reached a conclusion and took off across the field, and the morning continued. That was the spring the sign went up above the door of the small room on Main Street. Not because Zara had asked for one, but because Ethan had made it in the workshop on a Tuesday evening and carried it down the street on a Wednesday morning and put it up while she was seeing patients. And she had come out during a break between visits and stood looking at it. It said, "Zara of Ashevale, healer, not traveler. Not of the border camp, not orc woman passing through. Of Ashevale." She stood under it for a while in the spring morning, looking up at the letters that Ethan had carved in the style he used for the lintels above important doors, clean and deep and built to last. Then she went back inside and saw the next patient. Martha passed it that afternoon on her way to the weaver's quarter. She stopped. She stood in front of it for a moment, reading the words that everyone in Ashevale had already read or would shortly read. She walked on. She did not look sideways. And it was enough. There is a particular quality to a place that has decided to keep you. It is not announced. It is not declared at any meeting or posted on any board. It is assembled, quietly, from small decisions made by many people over time. The merchant who no longer turns away when you pass. The child who runs to the gate when she sees you coming. The old man who brings you the first preserved plums of the season because he remembers you told him once that they were your favorite. The warmth is real, but it does not arrive all at once. It comes the way spring comes, not in a single morning, but in the accumulation of mornings, each one a fraction warmer than the last, until one day you look up and the frost is gone and the pasture is green, and you cannot say exactly when it changed, only that it has. Zara could not say exactly when Ashevale changed. She could mark specific moments. The first patient who came in daylight. The first child who called her by name without being instructed to. The first time someone from the village greeted her in the street as an ordinary greeting, not an acknowledgement of an unusual circumstance. Just one person saying good morning to another person in the way you do it every day because it is the right thing to do and also because you have run out of energy for making it complicated. She could not say when it changed, but she could see that it had changed. She could also see, though she was careful not to make too much of this, because making too much of things was not a habit she had ever had room for, that Ethan had known it would. Not in the specific details, perhaps, not the exact sequence of events, but in the general shape of it, that people in small places are practical about what they need, and that what they needed was someone who knew what Zara knew, and that need and time would do the work that argument and persuasion could not. He had offered her the room because it was right, not because he had calculated the outcome. She believed that. But he had not been surprised by the outcome either. She believed that too. One evening she asked him about it, directly, the way she had learned to ask him things, simply, without preface, in the manner of two people who had stopped requiring run-ups to the things they wanted to know. "Did you know?" she said. "When you offered me the room. Did you know it would go like this?" They were at the table, the dinner things still between them, the lamp lit. He turned his cup in his hands, which was what he did when he was thinking carefully. "No," he said. She waited. "I knew what was right," he said. That was all. She looked at him. He looked at her. "That was enough," she said. He set down his cup. Outside the evening was clear and cold, the sky going through its sequence of blues, and the horses were settled. And down the road, the village of Ashevale was going through the small, ordinary processes by which a day becomes a night and a night becomes tomorrow. "Yes," he said. It was.